welcome to the 10 o'clock starting session here. We have H. Hatfield with Having the Answer, Caching Strategies and Tips. He's the Director of Development at Deseret Digital Media. He's been programming PHP since PHP 3, lives with his wife and twins in Layton, Utah. So please welcome H. Hatfield.
Thanks, Ryan. I'll pay you afterwards. So I'm H. Hatfield. As we've just been discussing, that really is my name. It's one letter. There is no dot. The end. So, how many of you have ever done any caching before on your websites? How many of you have found it beneficial? How many of you think you're doing it right? Okay, I have 2 volunteers to give this talk now. That's perfect. So, even though the title is Having the Answer, that's not me claiming that I have the answer. That's kind of what caching is, right? It's having the answer when you need it. So, the first thing I'd like to say is I used to sing in the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and I think I just turned the microphone off somehow. So, forget it. Hello?
We can hear you.
Yeah. So, I was a little worried about how some of these might show up on the slides. But Mormon Tabernacle Choir, local choir of about 300 voices. And what does this have to do with caching? They have about 100 songs that they are expected to be able to sing at a moment's notice. One time during a rehearsal, the power went out, and the conductor said, "Okay, everybody, let's sing this song." It was a song that we hadn't sung in 2 years. But the expectation was that we would know it and have it ready to go. I don't expect your cache timeouts to be 2 years, but caching is not something that computers alone do. People do it all the time. We just call it remembering. So this is why I do what I do. This is my family, my wife and my 1-year-old twins. This is my world. And just to give a little background, my wife and I have been married for 3 years, and every once in a while I can remember my kids' names. I usually call them the boy and the girl, but that's not their names. So, a little bit of history about where I've worked. This will become important as we talk about caching strategies. I currently work for Deseret Digital Media. It's a local company here. We do the websites for KSL.com and Utah.com. The teams that I work with specifically, we work with a local directory and a Groupon clone. Prior to this, I worked at a company called Money Desktop, near and dear to some of our hearts. Before Money Desktop became popular in the Valley as a place hiring a lot of developers. Before that, I worked for a company called what's now Remedy Informatics. It used to be Remedy NV. Yeah. Doing medical patient software, so doctors could go in and perform their visits, keep track of everything, and then also being able to do research on that data. So a lot of data there. I worked for a web dev shop called iNets. While I was there, we worked on websites for Mrs. Field cookies. Can I get a yay for cookies? Yay for cookies. And my network's trying to revalidate, so we'll just cancel that. And in the presentation. And we're back. Yeah. So, creating keepsakes magazines. Who in here is a scrapbooker? I didn't think many people would be, but they have events every once in a while called Creating Keepsake University, where they will teach people how to scrapbook. Any guess into how long it takes one of those universities, which will have upwards of 500 seats available to sell out? Any guess?
10 minutes.
No, that's way too long.
Wow.
Right? So these things would sell out in the span of about 2 to 3 minutes.
Wow.
So we may not think of scrapbooking as a very popular thing, but to people in it, it's cutthroat. There are very interesting caching problems when you have to deal with a lot of people trying to buy something in a very short amount of time. I'll tell you this, we ended up overselling quite a bit. And most of it had to do with how we were caching things. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Industrial supply,
Another local company, they sell things to big construction people. You want to buy bulk batteries before Costco was popular, you can get them here, except the bulk we're talking about is in the hundreds, not in the 30s. So very similar to Mrs. Fields, as in it's a catalog thing, but Mrs. Fields on their busiest day would do $500,000 of business. Industrial Supply on their busiest day would do 2,000. And there's big caching differences even between similar sites that have different audiences. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Like I said, caching is all about having the answer. You may not be able to read what it says on his drum head there, but this is the Answer Band. There's a band called The Answer. They play good music. Look them up. What is a cache? As we all know, it's a group of things that have been hidden in a secret place because they are illegal or have been stolen. For those of you who don't believe me, go to Merriam-Webster, the #1 answer, right? Like the top definition. Everything that you've ever thought you were doing with caching, it's illegal. Stop it.
That's what I use it for.
Yes. So, all the drugs that you're hiding on your website, don't do it anymore. The title of this talk is Caching Strategies and Tips. So we're going to go into strategies first. Strategy is constructing something unique from the same set of building blocks your competitors have. We all have the same tool sets available to us, but we all have unique problems that we're solving, and that's where caching strategies come in. Is how do we solve our unique problems with the same tools that everybody else is using, and tools that were written by someone who had a different unique problem than you. So the first one we'll talk about is memoization. Who here is familiar with this term? Everyone in the back is now available to give this talk as well. So memoization is not a typo, but it is a made-up word. A guy back in the 60s said, I need a word that means don't compute it again if you've already computed it, just use the value that you already used. And he's like, well, there's this Latin word memorandum, which is kind of like to remember something. I'll just call it memoization and hope people don't think I'm speaking with a lisp or have some other sort of impediment. But do you remember the game Simon? Who here ever played the game Simon? Yeah, this is memoization at its finest, right? The strategy behind Simon, or the whole game, is I'm going to play one color, and you have to press back the color that it showed. And then we're going to show two colors, the first color and another one, perhaps another one. And you have to press both of them in order. And each round, it plays everything that it's played before and adds a new one. So how far could you ever get in that game? Anyone that can remember, could you ever get past 10? Yeah, 10, 15, 20? You were writing them down. Yeah.
No, I was a little kid. I had a lot of time in the car.
Yeah. So humans typically have a memory span that holds about 10 items in it. That's one reason why phone numbers are 10 digits long, is that's about the limit of what humans can remember in very short-term memory. Computers have the ability to somehow remember more in that amount of time. Call it magic. But let's say that the classic example for memoization in computers is factorial. So anybody know what a factorial is? Anybody who doesn't know? Right? It's something you learn in math that they tell you is very important that you never use again until you do probabilities. And then you never use probabilities again until you need to figure out if you need to invalidate your cache. So, and see if it's a good time to do that, but that's not for another 20 minutes, so don't get too excited. We're not going to talk about probabilities yet. So factorial is whatever number you are, it's u times the multiplicative sum. Everything else beneath you multiplied together, right? So 3 factorial is 3 times 2 times 1. How many of you have written a factorial function? Did you do it recursively or iteratively? Yeah, that's the introduction to recursion as well, right? And memoization and recursion, I wouldn't necessarily say they go hand in hand, but they work well together, right? If you're using recursion, it's kind of like memoization is really just a next step. Instead of diving down another level each time, you say, well, I've already calculated it, so I'm just going to use the value. So if you need 3 factorial and then later on you need 5 factorial, you only have to calculate 5 times 4 times this answer I've already got, right? Memoization is that exact thing. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, you bet.
So where can we use this in web development or in other PHP development? And this is really a fancy term for function level caching. If you've got an expensive function that you're calling, regardless of what it does, you can cache it using memoization, which essentially means take the result, shove it somewhere, and when you want it later, check to see if it's there. Use it. Your expensive functions are typically going to be those that involve a database. And memoization works great, function level caching works great, as long as the answer doesn't change given the same parameters. If the answer is going to change given those parameters, you probably don't want function level caching. At that point, it's probably going to be in an object, and because you're going to say, give me user 1, and that data may be different than it was last time. With a function, you're going to say multiply 2 times 2. And except for those people who are going to argue that it's going to be 5 for some large value of 2, that answer is not going to change. Also not very expensive, right? But let's say that you do have an expensive function that says calculate the average wait time of everybody that's been on hold during the past 5 years. But I only want it as of yesterday, right? So from 5 years through yesterday, what's the average wait time? That's not going to change for a 24-hour period. That's a long time in caching world. So that's something that's easy to put in a function. Run that function, let it do crazy calculations, store it so the next time you ask for it, the user gets it instantaneously as opposed to waiting 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, however long it takes to run these queries, right? We won't talk about query caching, but if your query is taking 2 minutes to run, please cache it and do something like this. That's function level caching. Do you have any questions about function level caching? Have you ever used something like this before? Please. Oh, you've used it. Yeah, great. Any complaints about function level caching? Yeah. Debugging. And that meaning that when you're trying to figure out where the problem is, you've got to look somewhere else. You've got to check to see if the problem's in the cache as opposed to in the function. Yeah. So that's a general problem with caching. And that is something that we'll talk about later, is the complexity that's added by using caching. You can't avoid it. You've automatically, as soon as you start using caching, added a level of complexity that was not there before. You've added another point of failure, and what happens if your cache fails? Is your system crippled because it's no longer cached? For some sites, the answer is they're unusable. And that's a big problem, and we talk a little bit about how to solve that in a minute. So, function level caching. Next, we'll talk about object level caching. This is the only slide I have for that. No, it's not true. So we have building blocks here. These are representative of our objects. These are the users on your site. These are whatever your model is. And you can look at object level caching as very similar to function level caching, except the parameters are slightly different. With a function level cache, you might pass in an array of numbers, a zip code, because you're calculating a distance, or whatever it may be. With an object level cache, you're usually just passing the ID of the object, telling the cache how to look it up. So if I want to look up A, B, or C, and I apologize, these are much brighter on my screen. I tried turning the lights off, but it didn't help. So
Do you want me to close the blinds?
if you think it might help, that'd be great.
I'll try not to disrupt you.
No, that's fine. Because really, the only thing disrupting does is make the talk go longer, right? So object level caching, we have our A, B, and C. You're going to say, hey, whatever your object manager is, give me block C. And I want to be able to run some functions on it. Because with block C, I can start stacking it. Might have a collection of blocks that's stored in cache. The main difference between function level and object level caching is what you expect to do with it afterwards. With a function level cache, the value is the answer. With an object level cache, typically you want the object back so that you can perform some function on it, which may or may not be cached, and that is the answer that you're in the end looking for. So the object level cache is kind of an intermediate step that's used to help speed up your site. Mainly because you probably have a lot of different pages that all have a user object on them. A session is something that's a very common object cache where you want the session back so that you can grab more data out of it, add data to it, and you need it on every page. User information beyond that, let's say the user has profile information, Twitter friends, tweets that they've done, all of these you can store with this user object, get back from the cache, and perform new operations on it and save it back into the cache. You won't always run operations on it, but the expectation is that you can. So, object level caching is probably the kind of the trickiest to explain as far as when you would use it over function level caching, but that's in essence what it is. If you're going to be running more functions on it, it's probably in an object level cache. In your code, it's a lot easier to see. Is it a class or is it a function? And we're going to go now to page level caching. How many people are doing page level caching in here? Yeah. How many people know what it is? Okay, great. So page level caching is the holy grail of web caching. That also means it's the hardest to do right, because you're writing out the entire page. And that is the page that's going to be given back to the user when they make the request. And if anything goes wrong, then every user that gets that page gets the entire wrong page. Invalidating a page is a lot harder than invalidating a user or any other type of cache. Mainly because it's going to be stored on disk somewhere, usually. So you actually have to delete the file, which is slower, or change the key. But page level caching is a static rendering of whatever dynamic page you have. So if you're looking at your Twitter feed, a lot of times, Twitter has changed this over the years, but at one point they had a static page that would give you the most recent tweets within a 10-second, 20-second delay. And then after that, they would add some dynamic pieces onto it. But that initial page, if that was a popular user, would just be saved. So if a lot of tweets are, if there was a popular tweet and a lot of people were looking at that, they wouldn't have to re-render everything all over again. And because typically the page is the most expensive thing to render, the entire page. If it's a subcomponent of the page that's expensive to render, the page is expensive to render, right? I mean, you've got everything in there. You can't escape any inefficiencies at the page level. So, how do you handle the fact that pages can go stale really fast? This is where we start talking about when to use which strategy. So KSL.com, if you're not familiar with it, is a news site, first and foremost. And how often does a news site refresh? How often would you expect it to refresh? Every 5 minutes?
And then the news comes off of Twitter.
Well, yeah. How many of you go to CNN or something like that? Do you go more than 3 or 4 times a day? No. If you go to KSL for news, do you go there more than a handful of times a day? So your expectation of the refresh of the news, of something that you're going to see new, is in the span of at least an hour or so. But there's a lot of people that have that same expectation that are offset from you by an hour or so. Right? So KSL, news typically has about, you've got the headline news, which might sit there for a while, but everything else, about a 5 to 10 minute window where it's breaking, and about another 2-day window where people might care about it. So a pretty wide span. Utah.com is a travel site, and is becoming a travel site. How often would you expect a hotel to sell out a room and need to update their inventory? Depends on the hotel, right? And the event. Sundance is happening in Park City this weekend and next weekend. Those hotels sell out in a matter of hours, usually. So using page level caching on KSL is really easy because you've got a long time. And when I say a long time, to me minutes is a long time. If it's lasting 5 seconds, 10 seconds, you're probably better off not caching it unless it takes 20 seconds to calculate it. So I guess that's, we'll talk about some tips in a minute, but that's a big one. If it takes longer if it expires in a time that's quicker than what it takes to render it, just render it. And so, then we have the next site in here, Money Desktop. Personal finance. How many of you have ever used Mint.com? Yeah. How often do your numbers change? How often do you purchase something? Once, twice a day? On average, people make 3 purchases a day. Whether that's on their debit card, or buying something online, or whatever. 3 purchases a day. Now, if you have a budget for the entire month, you can cache this entire budget for, cache it once in the day, you're good the rest of the day. The only thing you have to worry about is so many people using your system that it gets evicted out of the cache and you have to regenerate it then. You don't really have to worry about it expiring. So Money Desktop is a great place to use some object level caching on the budget itself, on the transactions, because the transactions never change. You may go in and edit it and say, when I went to Costco, even though I spent $500, because that's an average Costco run, right? $100 was on food for me, $300 was on food for my twins, and $100 was on something fun, whatever. You split your transactions out. Those now are 3 new transactions that will live forever. You can cache those anywhere, and the only reason you would ever want to expire them is if someone updated it. So that's kind of an on-demand expiration as opposed to just a time expiration. RemedyMD, where Ryan and I used to work, patient stuff, your visit stuff. How many variables would you expect one patient visit to have? You go to the doctor, and you get seen because you're sick, how many variables would you expect there? 10? More than 10? More than 100? More than 1,000? More than 1,000 variables in every doctor visit that we would track. Give them the ability to track. It doesn't mean that every visit uses every variable, but every object has space for every variable. So you don't always, when you're using object level caching, get to choose which parts of the object you're caching. If it would use 1,000 variables, you have to cache the entire thing or find a way to cache the important parts. And that becomes really tricky, right? So RemedyMD, object level caching for sure. Page level caching won't work at that scale. Because a doctor visit, there's just too much data that you have to put on the page for it to be able to be efficient. You're not going to use that page again, I guess is the best way to say it. You're not going to render that page anytime frequently enough, or the time between them is not going to be frequent enough for it to matter. You can spend all the time rendering the page statically and they'll never look at it again. For a week, 2 weeks, the patient looks at it when their bill comes in, says what actually happened. So make sure when you're caching something that you're going to use it again. Because caching takes effort. Mental effort to figure out how to cache it, but programming effort to actually do it. So don't cache it if you're not going to use it. That would have been a great slide to have in here, but I didn't. Next, mrsfields.com. We talked a little bit about it. $500,000 of sales in one day for a cookie company is pretty good. We manage their inventory online though, right? So this is another inventory question. How do you manage inventory like that? Show a user that they can still purchase something and reserve it so that by the time they go to check out, they can still check out and everybody else can see that it's sold out, but you can't let it stay in their cart so long that other people can't buy it. So there's a lot of things you have to cache there. You have to know how long it's been in their shopping cart. You have to know how long they have before it's expired. How many people have used Ticketmaster? You have 17 minutes to finish this talk, right? And otherwise someone else kicks you out and takes over your talk. That's a great new idea though, talkmaster.com. So these are problems that a lot of people have. And caching at some level or another solves each of them. And I hope you're seeing that you really do have to do due diligence on your individual site when we talk about strategies. The tips that we'll get to, I think, will be a little more helpful in figuring out generally what you can do with a cache. But please know that, I mean, this is where I've worked in the past 10 years. Each one of these had very different caching needs. So now we're to tips. Please tip your speaker. Right? So there's the joined in link in case you forgot. Please go to joined in, review the talks. If you don't, the speakers won't get better. If this talk sucks and you don't tell me, I'll give the same talk again and it will suck again. And it will be your fault that someone else suffers through it. I've never tried that wet line before. We'll see how that goes. So, measure all the things, right? Before you start caching, you need to know why you're caching. This is an interesting slide. It says, under 54 inches must be accompanied by an adult, and you have a 42-inch minimum to ride the ride. How many of you have defined on your website, or have defined what type of performance your website must have? It must perform, time to first byte must be under 200 milliseconds. Page load time must be under 500 milliseconds. Right? Do you have definitions like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't have definitions like that, you're going to go into caching blind. You're not really going to be understanding why you're caching. You just know that it's cool, right? Don't succumb to caching peer pressure. Don't do it just because the cool kids do. Do it because you have a measurable goal that you're trying to attain and it accomplishes something for you. So you need to fit inside that range, know where you're going. How many of you have ever heard of the thundering herd? Thundering herd of PHP elephants? No? So this is your site right here at the left edge of the screen. These are your users. And the problem is, they're all looking for the same thing and the cache just expired. What do you do? Right? Normally what happens is your system freaks out because everybody starts requesting the same object at the same time. And when that happens, the cache says, it's expired, go ask the database. And so now, instead of however many elephants there are there, being able to get the cached copy, every single one of them is going to start looking for the database copy of it. So your site that was wildly efficient right then has just now died because your cache expired and you weren't ready for it. Okay? So how do you prevent this? I was going to try and find a way to say avoid the Noid. Anyone remember Domino's commercials? Yeah. It just didn't fit, but oh well. So you cache your object here. It's going to expire there. Cache it again before it expires. Proactive caching. You really have to understand your site to know which objects you need to do this on. What are your most expensive objects as far as database time or any sort of calculation time? What are the most frequently used objects? Because if you have a lot of objects that are relatively expensive, but they're used a lot, pay attention to those. If you have some reports that get run that are very expensive but get looked at once a week, because the boss says, hey, what were the stats for the last week? Don't spend all your time figuring out how to cache that because it's not going to break your site. Right? It might make your boss wait for 5 minutes. He's got the time to wait. That's why he's your boss, because all they have is time. But have processes that will go in and preemptively cache things for you. If you're going to do page level caching, do it this way. Cache the page before someone has to render it. That way you never end up with someone having to pay the price of an expired cache. This is where measuring really comes into account. If you don't know which pages are getting hit the most, which pages need to be cached, then you might be really good at caching all the wrong objects. So there's that. And then, how many people wish that they were on this beach? Nice. Well, then why in the world did you come to Salt Lake for a conference? Our beaches are not like this. So, this is how you want your users to experience your site, right? Feels like a vacation. It's nice. What happens when your cache server crashes? Does it look something like that? And now all of a sudden your people are trapped behind a wall of ice trying to get to your site? So this is a cold start. How many people live in places where you have to plug in your car so that you can start it in the morning? Yeah, I don't either. But there are people that they have to plug in their cars overnight so that they can start them in the morning. So, because otherwise it's too cold for the battery to actually start. If your site is so dependent on caching to be functional that if your cache server goes down, and when it is restarted, no one can use your site, you have a problem. What do you do to get your site back up? Because this is thundering herd to the nth degree, right? I mean, it's Hannibal coming across the mountains with his elephants at that point.
We
And
use a client-side script to re-up the cache. I don't think it's a good solution, but it does work.
what was that? Sorry?
We use like a client-side script with wget to re-up the cache.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's exactly what you do, right? I mean, it's a concept called cache warming. And you need to have a strategy in place for that. You need to be prepared for that. And it goes again back to measurement. Because I'm sure that your client-side script that does this knows which pages to hit first. And those are going to be the pages that are the most crucial to getting your site working. And that first page may be a system's currently down for a minute. Don't be afraid to throw up a standby page while you're rebuilding your cache, because that will be a much better experience than everybody sitting there with a spinning loader. Okay? So, cache eviction. How many of you have ever received, I don't really want to know this, an eviction notice? Okay? Your cache objects will, on time to time, be evicted. I hope. If not, you're spending way too much money on your equipment for caching. If you have 100% cache hit rate, you've got a budget bigger than mine, right? You're going to have cache misses, and it's going to be sometimes, and it's going to be because you've had so many objects come into your cache that something's gotten bumped before it expired. And make sure you know whatever you're using for your cache, its eviction policy. Some will use least recently used. That's the most common and makes the most sense. If it's not using least recently used as a default, figure out if you can get it to do that. All right? There are other techniques or other algorithms that caching engines use for figuring out what to evict. I found least recently used to be the best one, to the point that I didn't even look up the other ones to remind myself what they were. But I have had, Memcache has a couple of options available. Least recently used is the default. It works in most cases. But you might want to know how often things are getting evicted from your cache. Because maybe you're caching things that don't need to be, because they're just not getting used. And what you don't want to have happen is to preemptively go back in and say, oh, it's been evicted, I need to recache that, and push something out that is useful. So, that's eviction. That's the end of what I have right now. So we'll now just take you back to the wonderful Mavericks screen. What kind of questions do you have about caching?
So I was wondering what you or some other people in this room, what are some of the low-level PHP techniques you use in cache? Do you write a file to the file system? Do you use memcache? What are some of the other ways?
Yeah, so the actual, the physical caching mechanism used. So what are people using for caching? How many people write out to the write out to a file system? Just by show of hands. No. How many people use file level sessions? Right? How many people know that's the default in PHP? Okay, good. So the default for session handling in PHP is file. Go change it, right? This really has, the most important thing there is again going to be measurement. So how many people use Memcache as a cache? How about Redis? Mongo? Yeah, so some of these other NoSQL languages are pretty good key value stores as well. And some of them have higher throughput than Memcache. Memcache is kind of the de facto standard. There's a lot written out there on how to use PHP with Memcache for sessions and other things. What you're going to want to know is, if you're choosing between file and something like Memcache, is the network latency worth the memory efficiency? Right? So if your internal network is so slow that it's faster for you to read from the file system and ship that out than it is to go across the network, load it in memory, or find it in memory, ship it back, and send that out, then yeah, file system can be an appropriate alternative. I hope your network's not that slow. But if it is, by all means, right? I mean, don't use a caching solution that everybody else uses just because they use it. Use what's right. But who uses anything other than Memcache in production right now?
Use Cassandra.
Cassandra, okay. Yeah, so another one of these NoSQL services that Cassandra, is Cassandra a key value store? Yeah. So any sort of key value store is going to offer you some of the same things. Does Cassandra allow for grouping of keys?
As far as I know.
Yeah. So one of the hardest things to do with cache invalidation, because everyone knows that's the hardest thing to do in computer science, right? Cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors are the two hardest things in computer science. So cache invalidation. How do you determine how long an object should live in your cache? Well, it shouldn't live in your cache any longer than is useful. So if a user spends, on average, which you know because you measured this, 5 minutes on your site, don't cache their user data for 2 hours. Because it's on average not going to be useful to you for that. Cache it for 10 minutes. And that way, if they're on there for, you know, the 95th percentile, 97th percentile of the time, everything's still there for them. And you can refresh that cache if you need to, that expiration time while they're there. But cache resources are typically a lot more expensive than your web server resources because they're all typically going to be memory. There are solutions out there like Couchbase, which allow for persistent memcache storage and clustered memcache storage. I think it's called Couchbase now. It used to be Membase. And Membase and Couchbase merged and it became Couchbase. That's a really neat idea because that kind of gets rid of your cache warming thing. What happens if your cache server crashes? It comes back up and everything's right there. That's pretty neat. The expense of that is you have to flush it at some point in time. How many people are using Memcache to store their sessions? How many of you just store your sessions in a database? How many of you use Memcache in front of a database to use your sessions? Only one possibility, right? So the authors of Memcache said, please do not use Memcache for sessions. And the reason for that is because it's not persistent. If the Memcache server gets bounced, you've just logged all of your users out. Most people find that a negative experience. So if you're going to use Memcache for your sessions, which I have no problem with, make sure that you have a database right behind. So that every 10 seconds or something, you have a script that goes in and flushes all of your cache to a database so that if you have to bounce your Memcache server, it's real quick to get it repopulated with, and there's a fallback. Your users are not going to be logged out. Something just might be a little slow for them for a second. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you. Please.
Your business fields cookie example, what if you have like a retail server that manages both retail available from the website and retail available in brick and mortar stores?
Yeah.
And it takes a long time, relatively, like a few seconds, to get an answer back from that retail service. So you say, how many of this product do you have? And it sits around for a minute and then it says, oh, I have 12 of them. Have you experienced anything like that? Do you have any caching strategies? Like we cache the object now, but it causes problems because if someone just bought it in the store.
That's right. You've oversold it now.
Yeah.
Right? So I imagine that's using some sort of EDI communication.
Similar, yes.
Similar, yeah. So, yeah, any specific strategy, no. What I would say there is if you know that there's going to be a delay, account for it and undersell.
Okay.
Right? So I would give yourself a buffer. For instance, on our KSL Deals site, we have this concept of oversell, where we know a deal might be so popular that we might oversell what a vendor has said we could. So, but we've agreed with the vendor that there's a certain percentage that we're allowed to oversell it. That makes the coding of the site a lot simpler. Because you say the limit is there's 100 of them, but we can oversell 20. And that's a lot easier to manage than that hard cutoff of 100. So yeah, that in general, caching is not going to help you much there because your data itself is out of date. And at that point, your cache has outlived the regeneration time of the data. So yeah. Anything else? Any complaints you'd like to address right now while I have the chance to fix them? Mr. Bird.
So PHP has two memcache extensions. There's that you can use, memcache and memcache D, right?
Yeah.
Which, but I understand the performance is pretty similar. Which do you use?
We use Memcache D.
Why?
Great question. Anything else? Sorry. Memcache D, if I remember correctly, is what's provided by the internals team, and Memcache was an external library that was provided. And so I believe Memcache D actually has a little bit of performance improvements. They do have some differences in their functionality, though. The two libraries do. So they are not a one-for-one trade. So look into that. We use Memcache D. It works great for us. I don't know why it wouldn't work great for anyone else, but I don't remember exactly what the difference is right now. Stump the speaker. Go.
So with full page caching,
Yeah.
which is great, but sometimes we'll have like different users logged in, so the header will be different. Have you done much like partial page caching, or how do you
Yeah.
handle stuff like that?
Great. So the question was full page caching with a little bit of dynamic data. So this is someplace where something like Varnish comes into play, where you can do edge side includes. So this talk was specifically kind of on server side caching strategies, and I was going to talk. I had probably a half dozen slides talking about single page applications and Varnish and things like that, and what do you do just to make your user's experience better. So edge side includes are kind of the solution there. What you do is you tell the browser that the entire page is cached, and when it does its request back to your Varnish server or whatever reverse proxy you've got in front of it, that server will look and say, 95% of this is cached, but 5% of this is dynamic, which I may or may not have cached. I might have to go back to the server to request it. Or you can be really abusive to your Varnish server and say, remember all of the user-specific stuff too. And then that becomes cached. There's also an option of using local storage on the in the browser. So send it back with a cookie, send it back with a JavaScript variable once, store it in local storage, and let your application then display it. Client-side handling it, right? So there are a couple of options there, but none of them that really reach all the way back to the server. So thank you. Anything else?
One of the things I would like to add for server-side caching, if someone here is not using APC, it gives you benefits out of the box with off-code caching, and you can.
Great. I don't know if everybody heard that. Use APC. If you're using PHP and you don't have APC turned on, turn it on, and first tell your boss that you want to raise if you can improve your site performance by 20 to 30%. Then turn on APC and ask for your raise, right? It really is that type of increase to get your opcodes cached. Thank you. Please.
What about Zendo Bcache versus APC?
If I'm not mistaken, everything is converging on one of them. So one of them is now built into I think it was the Zend one.
Yeah, Bcache is built into the 5.
Yeah, so in 5.5,
Yeah.
right? So if you're using PHP 5.5 now, there's a built-in opcache. Let's call APC the generic term for it that people might have heard. Turn on opcode caching. So thank you.
Zen claims that Zen cache is faster than Memcache.
So does everybody else.
Another thing is that
So-
Zen has session clustering, and they actually use, they write locally to the session, but then they do a UDP broadcast to basically memcache-like instances on another session, only if they're, to one other one. And then if there is a session miss, they then do a broadcast
To see if anybody else has it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Sort
there,
of a hybrid approach maybe too.
there are, and so that Zen cache that comes with Zen server, that's using something more akin to Couchbase, where they don't persist it, but it's the clustered aspect of it. There's also a clustering that you can put in front of Memcache, which has a really cool name. I want to say it's Moxie, M-O-X-I, which is a Memcache proxy tool where you can set up all these things. So yeah, these are available outside of that Zen cache if you're not paying for Zen server. So yeah. Anything else? We have time for half a question. Okay. Thank you very much for your time, and please go to Joined In, and I should have left that as the last slide. Huh? So, thank you.